What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Brandon Morse here for Red State. I just kind of wanted to stop and cover something that I found very, very, very interesting. And I find it very interesting because, naturally, they're attacks on me. But they're not just attacks on me. They're attacks on people who think like me, people who like story structure, who like to see great works go unmolested by people who do not have the talent of better men than themselves, better men and women than themselves. You can see this happening right now in the way that I am being lambasted for a take that I've had, a continuous take that I've had, on Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power series. CNN covered an article that featured me, and to CNN's credit, they actually did give me a fair shake. The author did not try to paint me as a racist during our conversations at all. He was fair to me in his reporting. So hats off to them. I will give them credit for that. However, many other places took the CNN article and began throwing major temper tantrums, including at CNN and the author of the article, for not trying to paint me as a racist, for not trying to insinuate that I'm a racist even. However, what they did end up doing is taking that ball for themselves and running with it. They have tried multiple times to paint me and people like me, whether it's Gary from Nerdrotic, Jeremy from The Quartering, RK Outpost, Yellow Flash, Comics Division, all of these people who have spoken out about this perversion of Tolkien's works. They've tried to paint us as racist bigots, sexists, you name it. All the ists and phobes you can think of. And I'll show it to you right here. You've had articles from The Atlantic, Fear of a Black Hobbit. Wonket, actual racist trolls real mad about fictional black elves and hobbits. We got this covered. Racist reactions to Rings of Power casting reveal ugly side of Tolkien fandom. USA Today, for Middle Earth's sake, there's elf diversity in the Rings of Power, what's next? And The Gauntlet, forced diversity complaints are ever increasingly forced. The latest one, and by the way, there was a whole bunch of smaller websites that also had to write very, very nasty things about me, which, hey, bring it. I'm going to keep seeing the truth. The latest one came out from the Michigan Daily, which is kind of the paper for the University of Michigan. And it reads, "Dear bigots, read a damn book." And Tate Lafreniere goes into accusing me of being a racist, and not just that, but an idiot, as well as a few other ad hominems. This man claims to be a huge, huge Tolkien fan, but not necessarily just for his story, but because of who Tolkien is. But here's the issue. This man proceeds to try to act like he is a Tolkien expert while accusing Tolkien of being racist. He kind of agrees with the accusation that parts of Tolkien's story, The Lord of the Rings, is in fact racist. And he kind of contradicts himself. This guy writes like a buffoon, to be honest with you. I'm just going to go ahead and read you this part. "I also have to acknowledge the elephant in the room and address the fact that Tolkien, a white upper-class British Anglophile in the mid-20th century, was probably at least a teensy bit racist. If he saw me walking toward him on the street in the dark, he might have even clutched his pearls. Not to mention that for decades, the Lord of the Rings trilogy has been accused of having racist undertones. However, here is not the place to debate whether those accusations have any credibility. I think that this is the place to debate those accusations. For one, Tolkien did not actually like allegory. He was not saying anybody or anything about any one race here in real life with any of the races in Middle-earth. Yet, despite the fact that he has been outwardly saying, I'm not a big fan of allegory, unlike his buddy C.S. Lewis, who used it all the time, you had people accusing Tolkien of racism. For instance, saying that, well, what Tolkien really meant by the orcs is black people. He tried to make it seem, or they tried to make it seem, like he had some sort of racist intention behind his story making. No, he didn't. The only intention for racism or any kind of actual attack on anybody else generally comes from the left when they try to insert messages into their storytelling all the time. All the time. So they do it so much that they can't possibly fathom that somebody else wouldn't do it. He continues, many others have broken down why Morse and those like him are idiots for thinking black hobbits are heresy. I don't think that black hobbits are necessarily heresy. They just don't fit in the story. Tolkien made a story for the English, a mythology for the English. In fact, many of the ways that people look in there are written into the story. Here's why they look like they do. Hobbits are burrowing creatures, typically. So, yeah, and they live in an area that mimics England. Of course they would have white skin. Dwarves, they live underground. Of course they would have lighter skin. Okay? Elves, their whole primary thing was living under the stars. They loved the stars more than anything. Or they lived in forests. Of course they would have lighter skin. A lot of these things make sense. Now, that does not say, and I'm not saying, that there aren't people of different colors in Middle-earth. There is the South and the East that really didn't get discussed all that much. And I would have loved to see a show about that. In fact, that's what I told the CNN author. I would love to see a show about those areas. What happened to the Blue Wizards? The Blue Wizards who went there to those areas in order to try to fight Sauron on those fronts. We don't have any stories about them. I would love to have some. And I imagine that those cultures have darker-skinned people. But they didn't decide to cover that. They wanted to DEI Middle-earth as much as possible in the stories that we know. Because that's what the left does. They can't introduce their concepts to you nakedly, because if you do, you will reject them outright. They don't make any sense. They're usually victim and oppressor focused. After a while, they got too many rules. After a while, it becomes boring. So what do? In order to introduce their politics to the mainstream, they have to attach it like a leech onto the back of something that actually was successful and deliver it to you that way. They think that if you love this thing and they attach their politics to it, then you might start to normalize their politics as well. That's not how this works. And this is why you see such a rejection of the Rings of Power. This is why on Rotten Tomatoes it has such a low rating. It's because people are rejecting this bastardization, this perversion of Tolkien. And yet you have these huge Tolkien fans like this guy at Michigan Daily trying to pretend like they're bigger Tolkien fans and we don't know what we're talking about. We, the fans. It's ridiculous. But it gets more ridiculous. Tolkien died before he ever completed these stories. They went through countless drafts and were never meant to be published in that state. They were only published after Tolkien's son Christopher cobbled together numerous drafts to form a cohesive story that resembled his father's original version. This means Morse's logic that woke leftists are corrupting the original intent of the story is hogwash because the story was never meant to be seen. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Once again, you are assigning things to Tolkien that aren't even there in order to support this whole idea that leftism coming to Middle-earth is natural. It's not. It is unnatural. It is a perversion of the story. You are introducing politics where politics was never supposed to be. You are not just doing that, you are corrupting the characters that Tolkien wrote in order to make it some sort of DEI fantasy. You can't just say, well, Tolkien never wrote it, and so therefore I can just insert what I need to in order for it to be a story that is complete and worthy of being seen. Nonsense. It was already a story worthy of being seen. That is why it is an international hit. In fact, as a translation of Old English, he understood better that most of the necessity of changing source material so it can be properly translated, whether it's from one language to another or from the page to the screen. What? He understood better than most the necessity of changing source material so it can be properly translated. What do you mean properly translated? This makes absolutely no sense. This is coming from Tolkien's concern was translation of language. Here you're talking about a translation of ideals. I'm starting to wonder if Morse skipped over all the hard words in the Silmarillion each of the 4 times he supposedly read the book. All of that aside, Morse might want to check out some of Tolkien's many condemnations of racism, including 1944 letter in which he describes apartheid in South Africa as horrific, and a 1959 valedictory address in which he says, I have the hatred of apartheid in my bones. Here's the funny part. I already did know about that, but didn't you just a minute ago say that Tolkien was a teensy bit racist, despite not knowing the man, and yet you have proof right here that he's not racist? This guy is a buffoon. An absolute buffoon. Unfortunately, Brandon Morris and the band of racist fanboys aren't the only sad sacks who have co-opted Tolkien's body of work for the purpose of right-wing extremism. There's no right-wing extremism here. This is just people who want to keep a story intact. And this is why I show this to you. I'm going to go ahead and leave it. If you guys want to go check it out yourself, you can. I'm going to leave it there because I think you get the point. The reason I bring this up, this one particular article, is because it kind of sums up the left's reaction to us in general. These people who defend Tolkien, the people who defend, want to defend Marvel or Star Wars or anything like that. Story is important. Story really, since we were living in caves, we have relayed our history, our important lessons, everything through story. Jesus himself used to tell stories in order to get his point across. Stories are important. And a lot of people, they might see this as like, oh, well, it's just a fantasy world. What's the big deal? A lot of fantasy worlds, the way that we tell stories nowadays, craft the way that we see the world. It's the way that we learn morals. It is lessons. It's just so important to us as a society and a culture that our stories stay intact. These people are trying to perverse these stories in order to make and rewrite history and make their reality the reality. They're trying to make their truth the truth. But this is why they fight back so hard. It's because they know that in order for them to do that, they have to get past us, the fans. In order to take control of the culture, they have to defeat us first. This is why they lash out at us. This is why whenever we say anything about the Lord of the Rings of Power, whether it's about any of the Marvel properties, any of the Star Wars properties, that what we're doing is trying to defend our culture. These stories are a defense of culture, and they want to pervert them so that they can take it over. And we're not going to let them do that. If you can, speak out. Make sure that they understand that this is not going to be acceptable. Make sure they understand that, this is who we are as a people. It's not racism. It's not bigotry. We're protecting the stories that made our culture what it is today. Okay? And you know what? Someone who is far more creative later on can come down the line and actually make a story with different races in Tolkien stories. I would like to see it, but I would like it to make sense. Every story, everything you create, every world, every fantasy world has a logic to it. Once you break that logic, you start to kind of destroy the people's suspense of disbelief. That's really what this boils down to. Many people are trying to defend Tolkien in order to keep the story alive, keep it unperverted, keep it good. And in doing so, we protect our culture, we protect our history, we protect our past. We protect what makes us us. Don't let them unmake us by taking the stories that you grew up on, that you love, the characters, the places, the people, and making it theirs. Hey, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.